So it's December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2022. And we've passed the winter solstice, so we're beginning to receive more light. So this time of year, it's often the time people are getting together with their families and visiting different places. It's often quite a social time for some people. And I've been thinking about the imageries of Christmas and Christmas time, the lights, sort of sometimes the spectacles on TV, the things people put in their yards. At Abhayagiri Monastery, the closest neighbor, which is about 150 feet away, and they're actually surrounded by Chithurst land. The forest actually surrounds their entire property. They, on Christmas, put together an unbelievable visual spectacle with like a robotic Santa Claus and I don't even know, it's just incredibly elaborate, many different sights you can see. And so I've been reflecting recently about this sense that we utilize so much for ourselves, a sense of sight. And this has come about through a conversation I had it was like about an hour and a half with, I was lucky enough to have this with Joseph Goldstein. I'd asked him if I could come and speak with him when I was in Massachusetts at IMS for a month, and I was of course enjoying mostly the entire month the teachings of Lumpur Suchito, my foundational teachers, and Lumpur Suchito also touched on this in many talks. He'll speak about the visual sign, or how we really engage with the objects of the eye. But it was Joseph who was talking about this as something that he really lends himself to in his own practice. And I think if any of you can think about the sense, if we at least take out the sense of the mind, with the other five senses, it's really this visual sense that is so enthralling, interesting, absorbing. It's the sense where we get so much of our experience from. So much of our information comes from the object of sight. So for myself, when I give a Dhamma talk, I notice that I often will close my eyes, and I'll do that for like however long I give the talk for, and it's just that sense of needing to kind of step away from such an entrancing experience that I have, and so I kind of relate to that a lot, or have been trying to relate to that more so after talking with Joseph and really kind of thinking about this in my practice. So that the simplicity around it is just that oftentimes as we're walking around, we're not engaged in our formal practice, which for most of us, at least in the Theravada tradition, that's done with our eyes closed. Most people in the room have their eyes closed, at least the monastics do. And so that's fine. That's very, very good. But but there's so many times when we use this sense organ, the eye, the visual experience, and at least for myself, I have a tendency to just absorb into it and just forget like that there's a whole process going on that I'm not aware of. Even in just the use of the khandhas, we think of contact and then the feeling that arises from contact. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then we have the perception that arises in that. And this process is so incredibly fast. The perception is just a very quick notion of what something is when we're looking at it, and it's almost imperceptible, I think, that sense until we finally get into this kind of creating tendency. We kind of put it all together, and that's what the sankhara is. These are mental formations, they're formed by us. And finally, consciousness is the knowing of that. It's the cognizing, the sense that all of that is actually known. So with the eye object, this is happening so quickly that it's very easy for us to get absorbed, and it's very alluring. It's very much. I would estimate maybe 80% of the time this is the object we're paying attention to, and it's just very normal for us. But when you start to lend your mind to what the experience of that is, it's quite helpful, and it starts to break up that absorbing influence that the eye organ has, that eye consciousness has. And so the way this is often, or the way this can be done, is just, for example, if you open your eyes and you just look at an object, what is the immediate experience that you have? It's the eye goes out, and then it's this contact in a sense of like, what am I looking at? What are the features of it? Or the Buddha would call the features of the signs. Those things that we're grasping at, the specifics about it, the descriptors. And we then move into evaluating. We're continuously evaluating something that we're looking at. And this is just done in a constant way. It's done all the time. And so, people now with screens, I know when I look at a screen, it's just a complete absorption into it, where the sense of all time, things just are no longer existing. It's just sort of one click after the next, one interest after the next, and when that's not sort of checked or looked at, it has, I find, quite a detrimental, negative effect on the mind. It keeps things sort of cloudy, confused, and just based on developing more interest and desire to see more things. And so that's why it's very helpful. And one of the ways that we can attend to the visual sight is to actually come back into our bodies. We start to notice, like, whoa, what's actually happening in our minds? What's the experience we have? What we often forget is that we're breathing. We forget that there's there's a body. And so it's quite helpful to, whenever we're using that objective sight, to just keep coming back to bringing the mind inward. And as obvious as this might sound, I just want to ask the question, how often does this occur for us? How often are we lending that an interest to that? Are we sort of pulling away from the interest we have in sight, the spectacle, the allure of it? And this is what makes it hard, is that it is so alluring, it is so compelling, that we want to keep looking at things and exploring and understanding. And so what we're trying to gain in an understanding with this is a wise sort of reflection around how sight works, how we do get absorbed in visual imagery. When we look at another person, we determine things all about them. We determine their age, whether they're a threat to us, whether they are somebody who we might be attracted to, or somebody who we're repelled by. If they're a friend or a foe, just through our own vision, we start to put up either our own defenses, or we start to drop those defenses. We see somebody is friendly, there's no reason to be afraid. Or the opposite occurs. And this is all this all can be done through without using any of our other senses. And so that, as I'm saying, this is occurring constantly. Anytime we have our eyes open, this is where we're often perceiving and understanding. And so if we don't mark this as a point for our mindfulness, our awareness, then we're losing out on a huge part of our practice. In fact, that's where a lot of unchecked desires can arise, and we can lose a lot of perspective on what can be quite important in our lives, just because this visual object becomes so important to us. One of the ways that the Buddha talks about this is also through what he describes as yoniso manasikara. And that is, as I was talking about, having a wise attention to what we're looking at. And so in that way, we're actually checking our minds. We're actually seeing, okay, that we know that there's attraction, for example. We're seeing beauty. And so the Buddha encourages us to flip that and see, well, that's a sense of anicca, our sense of permanence around that. We're just seeing it as a permanent object of beauty, and we're not seeing that it's consistently changing. So the Buddha doesn't have a sense of not acknowledging beauty. He doesn't say it doesn't exist, but it's still something we're putting together. Beauty is still a sankhara. You can have two people looking at the same object, and one says that's quite beautiful, and the other might disagree. And so with that sense of beauty, we also can see that there are possibly things we're not looking at. We often ignore a lot of unbeautiful aspects of whatever objects we're looking at. So for example, we see a person who we're attracted to, or a very beautiful person, but then if you start to look closely, you can see that there are senses of that unbeautiful or the unattractive within that. One thing I've noticed just in I don't think I've ever seen any human being whose one of their eyes is not kind of as open as the other. This is in any kind of pictorial or just seeing a person live, seeing a person right in front of you. It's always that way. And we don't see that, this kind of imperfection, but it's in every single person I think I've ever seen. The eyes are not even. One is slightly more closed. It's somehow, I'm not sure how that works, but that's what I've consistently seen with people. I see it in myself. But when we look at somebody who we believe is very beautiful, or that's what comes to our mind, we actually don't see that unevenness. we might say something like, "Oh, they have such beautiful eyes." But if you look at deeply in somebody's eyes, you see blood vessels, imperfections there. But that's what we ignore. We're constantly moving our sense of attention to see beauty, to keep it going, because that's alluring to us, it's exciting, it's interesting. And in order to see beauty, the eye actually does have to keep moving. It has to keep continuing scanning an object and looking, because if you do look for a very long time in one particular place, well, usually boredom occurs. It's not very exciting to look at somebody's earlobe for 45 minutes. But if the mind is scanning, then just seeing a person and getting absorbed in their beauty, then that's what can occur. It's just moving and not staying at all in the same place, because, as I said, that's just too boring. And also, those imperfections would begin to show up. So even our sense of sight isn't real, it's not true, it's something that is deceiving us in many ways. And so wise attention, this yoniso manasikara, it's kind of the way that word works is yoniso is like origin or womb, the beginning of things, the origin of things, or the womb of where things begin. So that's and then manasikara is a sense of attention. So it's paying attention to the origin, or paying attention to actually like seeing clearly into something, or how something begins. And so the Buddha really encouraged us with that in terms of this sense of impermanence. And so we try to pay attention to, for our understanding of the Dhamma, that as much as we create an idea of permanence in our visual experiences, they're constantly not permanent. There are senses we have that things are changing all the time. And if you think about somebody who has something like color blindness, it's not even like, we can't even say that color is actually true. Some of us can't even agree on colors that we see. So these are kind of changing phenomena all the time. Or if you think about how often you mistake things with your vision, you can mistake people. And all kinds of things can occur that are fooling us in a way. There are even these kinds of times when these psychological experiments where you can look at particular things, and it really appears to you that absolutely a particular line or object or whatever it might be is bigger than another, and it's just wrong. It's not true. So vision is also something that we put a lot of trust into. We talk about that. We say seeing is believing. But it's really more of an experience of we should have, is really telling ourselves from the Buddhist perspective, is seeing is disbelieving, or at least it would be helpful if we lended ourselves to that. Often another aspect of sight within this sense of yoniso manasikara is that we ignore the element of dukkha around it. That you can't always have pleasant visual experiences. That there's a side of discomfort or dis-ease that will arise with the eye object. And what I find is that's constantly trying to be hidden, that sense of dukkha. And it's just something that, like, if we're looking for interest, entertainment, we can't do that unless, again, we're constantly creating that within our visual field. And so we're often running away from this sense of dukkha, this discomfort, that might come from boredom or whatever it is that we're experiencing from our sight. And so it's quite an incredible sense object to be paying attention to, our sense organ that we're paying attention to, and it's quite helpful when we really start to lend our minds to it as much as we can throughout every day, every hour that we can try to bring that up. Like, what am I actually looking at? And we can question that for ourselves. We say, oh, I'm looking at this person, or I'm looking at myself in the mirror. And how do we create that for each other? How do we, for example, when you look in the mirror, have you stared in the mirror for like 20 minutes, and would that be a comfortable thing? Where does the mind go? Does it start to notice age? Does the thought of death come up? Illness? I don't know if I've ever heard somebody thinking, oh, I wish I looked a lot older. I wish there were more gray hairs, or more pockmarks, scars. And how is it that we're so attuned to a face? The face of our own, defining who and what we are. That's where, often we can see a sense of self arise. And there's so much that we're missing if we're not really paying attention to this, if we're not paying attention to that sense organ that I said was what I estimated about 80% of our experience. That's where we receive so much of our information. And yet if we're not really bringing that to mind, then we're missing out on so much of our experience with what the Buddha is really encouraging us through with his teachings. It's possible if we really lended our minds to our object of sight, this could allow for a very deep quality of understanding the Dhamma, understanding the truth. So I think what we have to be very careful of is how sight is encouraging us not to do that, or how our minds attuning to the visual objects there's a sense of why bother, or I'd rather enjoy this without actually having to perceive something or do something different. And it can seem like the whole intention around our objects of sight and our sense organs and eye consciousness, how these kind of come together through contact. It's almost like, well, no, the intention is for enjoyment. We want to enjoy what we're seeing. And from a sensual point of view, it makes sense. That's of course what we want. But I think from the Dhamma side of it, what we want to start doing is to enjoy seeing the Dhamma through our visual experience. So when we're paying attention to objects of sight, we're actually enjoying our own understanding of the impermanence of those objects. The dukkha that is held within our own sense of creating a permanence around them, or creating beauty. So in terms of actually practicing with this, I think one of the main aspects and the easiest aspects around it are, as I started to mention in the beginning of the talk, is really paying attention to our bodies. And really trying to have a sense of understanding how the mind goes out out into the physical objects that we see and becomes absorbed by them or absorbed into them. And that's our desire. There isn't a sense of wanting to really analyze or see clearly through this, because the whole idea is to really kind of, as I said, enjoy what it is we're seeing. My mom just mentioned to me that my brother is on a flight to Paris right now. And what does that conjure up when I say that to you? Paris. It's usually a visual image. What are we seeing? Eiffel Tower, I think it's the Champs-Élysées, or Élysée, all the qualities of France, the beaches, the whatever it might be. But of course, Paris brings up a certain visual sense, and the what came to my mind, it wasn't so soon after, right when my mom said it, but it was like, oh, the sights my brother will see, the enjoyment he will have, walking through Paris, being in Paris. And that's why people will go and they'll fly all the way around the world. They can see a city. It's an incredible aspect of human beings that we do. We have this incredible technology, and in order to have access to all of these visual things, we're willing to get on a machine that flies us around the world, and then so we can have these spectacles of visual experiences. The Buddha, in one of his more profound suttas, explains that we can't get to, we can't realize Nibbana by just kind of continuing on, seeking world after world. Even if we were to go to see every heavenly realm and hell realm and ghostly realms and go through the entire universe traveling, it's just, we can't get there that way. That's not how Nibbana is realized. It's an internal job. And so now, of course, people don't need to they don't need to go to Paris. We can just put on our, I think it's called Oculus or whatever. We can turn on our screens. We can see the whole world. For hours, we can forget to eat or drink. And this absorption, this just occurs, and it's just seen as having a greater good. So I think if we're practicing with the Buddha's teachings, then it's just more and more lending ourselves to an interest in this process of our absorption into visual experience. And it takes a lot of reminding and cajoling and trying to get the mind interested in this, in the Dhamma aspect of sight, because of that particular allure. And so then when we start to really push ourselves in that direction, I think the world can open up, especially if we're using mindfulness of the body and noticing just how that very process works and how that sense of experience of moving into our visual consciousness works. So that we're not so allured by it, we're not so entranced by it. And we get to see that there's a danger in that entrancement, that almost entrapment through that I consciousness. And that there are particular feelings, there's particular experiences that we have, a whole emotive field that we might not be aware of if we're not paying attention to it. And we can begin to see that there are some things that we don't want to look at. They're too enticing for us, or they haven't really helped us in certain ways. And it doesn't mean that we close our eyes, but we start to see very clearly, okay, what is it that's helpful for me to pay attention to, and what is it that it is not? What is not helpful for me to lend my attention to? How can I keep myself from being absorbed? It's possible to do this, for example, like just watching a movie, or seeing other people, We can continue to, come back to the body and draw our understanding from that experience, from what it is that we're seeing. And so it's not a sense of just closing our eyes and cutting ourselves off. It's really trying to lend our mind to an interest in what is actually going on. Why do I keep looking in this direction, looking for this satisfaction? And so then when we see the truth of it, we say like, oh, it's actually not that interesting. And we get interested in what our sort of internal experiences, what our minds are doing, how that dukkha is being experienced by us, and how we can extricate ourselves from it through just attending wisely, through mindfulness, being heedful with what it is we're paying attention to, what it is we're looking at. And also sometimes it is appropriate, when we know, oh, if I look at this particular thing, it's going to be stirring to me. And so then we start to recognize that there is a joy that comes out of not being stirred. There's a happiness that arises through that. And we can do that through that mindfulness of the body, that sense of our own experience of what it is that we're particularly feeling. So these are just some words of encouragement and just a reminder about something that's quite basic but very real for us. And there's not really much of an escape from for those of us who can see, acknowledging that there's some people that just can't see, and this is not the sense that they would be absorbed in it all. But for those of us who do see, then just to encourage that carefulness and really paying attention to how it is that we get absorbed and obsessed with the object, the eye organ, the objects of the eye.